Today's video is all about glass quality. So we've got the Vortex Crossfire, Diamondback, and Viper. Now, Vortex did supply us with all of these binoculars. They didn't pay us anything to do this video. The purpose of this video is to compare glass quality throughout different price ranges. This should be somewhat relevant even if you're looking at a brand other than Vortex. I am using the new capture system for all my digiscoping footage, and I've actually really liked it so far. It does remove here, so you have an everyday phone case. You've got two pieces, and then this ring here just depends on what size of ring you have on your optic. And one feature that is somewhat unique is that you can flip it around and use the 3x setting on the lens. So that's going to help us pick out a lot of the details and differences or similarities with this higher quality glass when you can really get in close and see the imperfections in the glass quality. We're going to start on this image. We have the Crossfire 10x42 on the left, Diamondback 10x42 in the center, and Viper 10x42 on the right. The first thing we'll look at is the diameter of the image, or actual field of view. Obviously, the cheaper glass has a smaller circle. The main downside here will be eye fatigue, but we'll talk more about that later. Aside from that, you'll notice pretty similar results in the edge-to-edge clarity and a little extra brightness from the Diamondback. You'll see the Crossfire and Diamondback have similar color profiles, and Viper gives us a more even, warm color profile. You'll also see that the Viper has a far more usable image. We'll dive into details in all of those categories in the next slide, but before we do that, I want to mention that the digiscope setup on the different binoculars was not totally ideal. Since they have a slightly different eye relief, the main thing I noticed is that the edge clarity on the Viper didn't show up as well on camera as it did in person. And on the Diamondback, the edge brightness was a little better in person than it showed up on camera. That being said, let's get into our next comparison. This is a lens test chart. Each optic is under the exact same conditions and placement. We'll use this test to highlight a few different areas of focus, then test those theories in real-world examples. So let's start with the edges. Notice the distortion of the paper's straight edge, the sharpness of the top of the paper, and the chromatic aberration or rainbow colors at the top of the paper. Next, look at the edge brightness and how quickly you lose light as you move outward on the glass. Look at the rate at which you lose sharpness as you move outward as well. There's a slight difference in each level of glass when you look at the circles here. However, as we move to the center of the glass, we begin to see fewer differences. So let's use the 3x lens and get a closer look at the center of the glass. We'll start by looking at the coloring. Notice how the Crossfire is less sharp at the ring, but overall you have fairly similar color contrast. Overall light transmission is actually better in the Diamondback in this test, and the Diamondback has higher contrast, which makes the numbers easier to read. You'll notice that the Viper is actually less sharp in this test. That may be due to poor testing on my part, but I did everything I could to get a sharp image, and this was the best I could do with the Viper. I had a similar result in testing with the UHD, but in real-world experience, I found the Viper and UHD to actually be sharper than the optics that performed well on this test. So just remember, this paper test is not everything. The Crossfire and Diamondback also have brighter highlights than the Viper, showing what we saw in the last slide, which is that the Viper has a softer, more even image. Let's examine the Crossfire for a bit though. Compared to the Diamondback, which is twice the price, I was quite impressed at what this cheap glass could do here. Sharpness and light transmission are very similar, and color contrast is actually best on the Crossfire. Look at the separation of greens right here. But as soon as you move to the outside of the coloring, the Diamondback and Viper show their strength in edge clarity over the Crossfire. All of this is good data, but let's get into some real examples and see what changes. This is our low light comparison. This was 30 minutes before sunrise, and as you can see in this example, there's a clear difference between the quality of these optics. There's a big difference in edge clarity and light transmission in all three. At this time of day, the Crossfire was pretty much unusable. The Diamondback was acceptable in the very center, and the Viper was good for about 50% of the glass. Take a look at this patch of trees here, and notice the importance of contrast. The Viper has significantly more usable image in this lighting. Overall, these are the conditions where you'll really see the benefits of purchasing quality glass. The sun is up now, and the Crossfire is starting to come out and show that it is still a usable binocular. In fact, when looking at the center of the Crossfire, you'll notice acceptable texture and contrast. Of course, the edges suffer very quickly. The Diamondback definitely has better texture than the Crossfire in this example. I think the Diamondback glass shows brighter highlights, but also has a more washed out image. The Viper continues to be a major step up in all aspects in this example. I think the coatings on the Viper did a better job at reducing glare, and that likely contributes to an improved edge quality and definition in the image. We're now in full daylight with an overcast sky. The Crossfire continues to catch up as light increases, and in this example, I'd say your biggest difference between it and the Diamondback would simply be eye fatigue. This is something that is difficult to measure, but in my opinion, the biggest reason to care about edge-to-edge quality is actually for eye fatigue. The more blurry and dark the edges of an optic are, and the smaller the actual field of view is, the more your eyes will feel strained after an hour of looking through the glass. This is why it can be so difficult to compare binoculars at a store. Your eyes are full of muscles that are constantly working, and the more clear your optic is, the less your eyes have to work. The Diamondback was a little better than the Crossfire in this category, but the Viper really was like a breath of fresh air. When switching to the Viper after a few minutes of looking through the Diamondback, it felt like a relief to all those muscles in my eyes and face. Many folks can attest that you don't need an expensive optic to spot game, but the more time you spend in the glass, the more you'll see. In this case, the Viper makes it far easier to spend more time in the glass. So far, we've concluded that the Viper has an obvious step up in low light conditions and eye fatigue, but what about actual clarity? For this example, we're only looking at the center of the glass using the 3x lens with the capture system. One quick mention is that if I were trying to film an animal through a scope, I would only ever use the zoom lens like this. So this is a pretty cool feature from capture. But let's look at clarity here. At first glance, there's not a ton of difference between these three. And honestly, I had a hard time picking out the areas for you to look. One place I found significant difference was in the little grass patches here. The Crossfire shows much less contrast and clarity. The Diamondback and Viper are pretty similar. The sunlight did change a bit as I was doing this, so the Viper looks like it has a softer image. I think that's due to light conditions though. Moving to this example, there's a few more things to compare. First, look at this branch here. The Viper has a sharper image, and you can tell what the edges look like quite a bit better. The Diamondback does okay in resolution, but overall, the texture and usability of the image is less. The Crossfire has even more distortion, and I think the branches all have a softer look to them. Think about trying to pick out an antler in the brush with all three of these optics, and it shouldn't take long to understand the benefit of the Viper. In conclusion, I'd say these three optics are well priced for what you're getting. The Diamondback is definitely better than the Crossfire in every way, but at the end of the day, it is still a similar optic that will give similar eye fatigue and have only small benefits over the Crossfire. The Viper, on the other hand, is truly a step above. There's plenty of scenarios where the Diamondback will be very close to the Viper, but when you're spending the last hour of the day picking apart a patch of brush, looking for a buck, you'll find the Viper will give you a true advantage. I never recommend going out of your budget for hunting gear, however, I'd really say the Viper is worth the upgrade in this scenario. If you go with the Diamondback, you'll want to upgrade in a few years, but when comparing the Viper with higher quality optics, I really think it holds its own and will be a worthy investment for years to come. That's all I have for you guys on this one. I am doing a few more optics comparisons, including comparing the Viper to the Razor HD and Razor UHD, as well as comparing a 10x32, 10x42, and 10x50 binocular and talking about the difference. If this video helped you choose what binos you want and you're ready to purchase, go to GearFool.com and start building waypoints to get discounts on future purchases. Thanks for watching, guys.